Yeah, thanks. So my name is Patrick Brown, and I am head of climate analytics at Interactive Brokers. I'm going to be talking today primarily from the perspective of a publishing climate scientist. And in that context, I'm interested in breaking the social feedback loops that constrain climate science and striving for a better public knowledge generation system and more public trust. So I'm going to premise this talk on 4 points, two that I think are well represented by the literature and two that are not. So the first is that just to get it out of the way, contemporary global warming is unequivocal and caused basically, we think, 100% by human activity. So it's warmed about 1.5 degrees Celsius since the Industrial Revolution. And by the way, that's about 4 degrees Fahrenheit over land in the mid-latitudes. And we can kind of apply that to all temperatures. So today we have a major heat wave. It's going to be 100 degrees. Under the same weather conditions, we would think that would be about 96 degrees in a pre-industrial climate. And that is mostly due to fossil fuel burning and the CO2 that accumulates in the atmosphere because of that. Now, global CO2 emissions, we think, are on the verge of plateauing, but they must reach near zero to halt further warming. It's just a matter of how fast you need to do that. And in order to adhere to the temperature targets that I'm going to be talking about in a little bit, that emissions reduction trajectory is very steep, and you need to do that very quickly. Okay, point 3 is that the influence of warming on local climate and weather extremes tends to be small compared to natural variability and or is overwhelmed by other drivers of change. So I'll give an example of both of those. One is global hurricane activity as represented by the annual count of hurricanes, tropical storms, hurricanes, major hurricanes, going back to 1980 when we have really good data. And so if there's a trend in this, it's pretty subtle, right? So this is a low signal to noise ratio effect. One where other drivers are overwhelming the climate impact would be global wildfire activity, here represented by total emissions of carbon from wildfires, and you get a very similar story if you look at area burned. But going back to 2002, and we have good data on that, we see a decline in global wildfire activity. And that's not because we don't think climate change is exacerbating wildfires. We do think that, but it's because land use changes are overwhelming the climate impact on wildfires at a global scale. And you see a very similar story if you go kind of extreme by extreme. So if you look at floods or droughts, extreme temperatures, as long as you're allowed to have the cold extremes kind of cancel out the hot extremes, and then other types of storms. So mid-latitude cyclones or low pressure systems or severe thunderstorms, tornadoes, wind, hail. Those are all very low signal to noise ratio effects of climate change. If the effect is detectable at all, or it's often contentious, the sign of the effect. And then there is this fourth point, which is the negative influence of warming on climate-sensitive societal outcomes tends to be completely overwhelmed by changes in society itself, by technological and economic advances. And so I'll just give you some examples of this, kind of food, water, and shelter. I'm using these graphs here as icons. I don't expect you to be able to read them, but for food, crop yields are up dramatically across basically all major crops and all regions since the 1960s. The calories available per person have increased dramatically over the past several decades. The number of people that die from malnutrition or from famines has declined dramatically over the past several decades, despite warming. Water, the share of the population with access to safe drinking water has dramatically increased. Shelter, the fraction of people that die from natural disasters has dramatically decreased over the past century. Health outcomes, things like climate-sensitive health outcomes like malaria have declined dramatically over the past 100 years. And even direct temperature health outcomes, so deaths due to cold and deaths due to heat have both declined. So deaths due to cold are declining partially because it's getting warmer, and deaths due to heat are declining because technological and economic advances are moving much faster than climate change is on those outcomes. So, access to air conditioning, better healthcare over time, et cetera. So I think there's a problem. And the problem is that these last 2 points are highly underrepresented by our knowledge generation system. And by our knowledge generation system, I'm referring to our scientific journals. So the poster children of those are our high impact journals of science and nature, and synthesis reports like the United States Fifth National Climate Assessment. And I think it's a problem that these are underrepresented because it diverts attention away from proven adaptation solutions that are resulting in this number 4. And it's also neglecting any risks from overly restrictive energy policies. And number 4 is really undergirded by fossil fueled industrialization. And so it's important not to ignore those those risks. So the question then is why? Why are these underrepresented by the knowledge generation system? So my claim would be that social and professional incentives do not reward surfacing those results or highlighting or centering those results, and rather they reward membership to what I'll call the good team. And what is the good team policy? Well, I think the good team policy was basically kind of coalesced in the 1980s and written down in the 1990s, and is represented by the international climate diplomacy policies. So in particular, the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, which was signed by basically all the countries in the world in 1994 with the goal of preventing dangerous human interference with the climate system. And so I say these are kind of left-coded in the sense that they embrace certain pantheistic tenets of the environmental left, like that impacting nature is kind of inherently wrong and self-destructive, and also embraces, global governance and redistribution. And so the point here, though, is that this was enshrined long before the vast majority of research on the subject was actually done. So the research on climate impacts or research on energy and energy transition away from fossil fuels. And the result of that has been, putting the policy first and then the research second in time, temporally, is decades of policy-based science. The ideal is that you have science-based policy, but what I observe is lots of policy-based science. So research explicitly, designed to support the policy or to be in service of the policy. And this is often solicited not so subtly. So I'll use nature and science as the examples here. This is, messaging espoused by the leadership of the journals is important. And so here's some messaging from the leadership of science. This is an op-ed written by the editor-in-chief of Science, Marcia McNutt, called The Beyond 2 Degree Inferno. Marcia McNutt, by the way, is now the president of the National Academy of Sciences. And so this is, very much a passionate defense of the international climate policy, the UN climate policy. She uses words like sinners to describe different behavior of humanity. She says, "I wonder where in the 9 circles Dante would place all of us who are borrowing against this earth in the name of economic growth, accumulating an environmental debt by burning fossil fuels." So this tells researchers, right, that there's probably going to be more direct and less direct paths to a publication in science if this is kind of the view of the leadership. And similarly, Nature has done things like, officially endorse Joe Biden for president in the 2020 election. And one of their supporting reasons is this international climate policy. Biden would return the United States to the Paris Agreement and is proposing the most ambitious domestic policies ever advocated by nominees for a country's major party. And then in 2024, Nature also endorsed Kamala Harris for, among other reasons, on climate grounds as well, that the domestic climate policies, the Inflation Reduction Act, align us with international climate goals. So this makes clear to me from Science and Nature that there are more or less direct paths to high impact publication, and probably a more direct path is to have your research kind of aligned with the good team. And I think that this distorts the aggregate message of the literature, and sometimes this can be pretty subtle. So it reorients the research question that's asked. So for example, rather than ask, what is the magnitude of the influence of climate change on the phenomena I'm studying relative to other relevant influences, it's more prudent for the researcher to ask, if they want to get published in Nature and Science, how does climate change negatively impact the phenomena I'm studying? And so this distinction is a distinction that I pointed out in my own paper that I published in Nature in an essay in the Free Press where I critiqued that framing. But this also has drifted to get, I think, a lot worse, where you see research where it basically seems like the researcher is asking the question to themselves, how can I frame my research to be optimally useful in support of the good team? And so you see that in terms of centering the virtue of the policy in the title and the abstract. So here's an example: large potential reduction in economic damages under UN mitigation targets, where this, by the way, is a benefit-only analysis and not a cost-benefit analysis, but that gets through peer review. Or the human imperative of stabilizing global climate change at 1.5 degrees Celsius, where if you read this paper, it's just quite clear that this is an assemblage of evidence in favor of a preconceived conclusion, and it's not like the authors were open to alternative conclusions. And now you even have a lot more straying further towards signaling membership of kind of the left side of the political aisle good team. where now you have a lot of papers where fossil fuel companies or companies in general are in the crosshairs. In this case, high income groups are in the crosshairs. High income groups disproportionately contribute to climate extremes worldwide, where in this paper they define climate extremes as only hot extremes and they neglect cold extremes. And so, hypothetically, a research group could have written a paper called High Income Groups Disproportionately Contribute to a Reduction in Climate Extremes Worldwide if they only looked at cold extremes. But of course, that wouldn't get through peer review, where this version does. And I think you see this even more, this kind of drift towards signaling membership with a good team, more in the assessment reports. So just an example from the National Climate Assessment. A key message of the climate assessment was systemic racism and discrimination exacerbate climate impacts on human health, where they do things like center result decrease in PSAT scores due to 1 degree hotter year, which I already think is quite dubious, but they're kind of showing their political stripes by dividing it by historically advantaged, historically disadvantaged, and then they have things like an art gallery with the understanding that together art and science move people to greater understanding and action. So explicitly an activist document. So I think there are some problems here with this overall literature. One is that you're professionally incentivized to produce signaling rather than the incentives being aligned to produce the most useful information and or the most complete information. And I think that type of information tends to be predictive information about the future. You have a lot of unfalsifiable claims, so analysis on the past and not very many true predictions about the future. Predictions about the future are made, but they're so heavily conditioned that they practically become useless. So it's, under assumption A, B, C, D, E, F, G, our results show eye-popping number X. But it turns out that assumptions A, B, C, D, E, F, G were like central to the problem. And so your results become practically useless if those assumptions are part of the input. And then in this environment, it's difficult to identify the best information producers. And so I won't belabor this point here, but I think this has led to an undermining of trust in science and universities. And so we see that in polls. Okay, so potential solutions. So first I'll flag an ill-advised solution, and that's to use the government to employ kind of hard censorship and dismantle climate science. So that appears to be what Trump is trying to do, defund climate studies, shut down climate research offices, shut down synthesis reports, and shut down public-facing websites. Okay, so I'm going to offer a different solution. I've been convinced of the utility of embracing prediction markets. This may seem a bit unconventional, but this is what I'm working on full time now, so hear me out. So I've written a lot about this now. That's probably most comprehensively summarized in this article, The Value of Climate Prediction Markets, hosted by Interactive Brokers. But what prediction markets do is they allow you to essentially bet on the outcome of future events. And so I'm interested in prediction markets in the environmental space. And the most famous bet in the environmental space was a bet between Paul Ehrlich, who was a professor at Stanford and wrote the book The Population Bomb, and Julian Simon, who's a professor at Illinois and then Maryland and wrote the book The Ultimate Resource. And Paul Ehrlich's thesis was essentially that finite resources on the planet and population is increasing, and so we are going to essentially run out of resources and large swaths of humanity are going to die of starvation or starve to death. And Julian Simon, his title, The Ultimate Resource, was essentially referring to human ingenuity as the ultimate resource. And so his thesis was, no, human innovation and substitution make it so that we're effectively increasing our resources over time, not running out. So Simon challenged Ehrlich to a bet, and the bet was, will the price of 5 metals, chromium, copper, nickel, tin, and tungsten, increase between September 29th, 1980 and September 29th, 1990? With the idea being that if they increase, we were effectively running out of resources, and if they decrease, then substitution and innovation was outpacing the depletion of resources. Now, Simon won the bet. All 5 metals decreased in price, but that's not the point of bringing this up. The point of bringing this up is that we see that this addresses the problems that I just highlighted. So incentives to produce signaling rather than being aligned to produce the most useful, complete information or predictive information. Well, there's no more direct incentive than having tangible financial skin in the game to kind of incentivize you to put forth your best understanding of reality. So I think it addresses that problem. Unfalsifiable claims. Well, a bet requires, very precise conditions, and so it makes the claim falsifiable by definition. And then difficult to identify the best information producers. Well, we don't have to rely on heuristics like, Ehrlich was at the more prestigious university or anything like that. We can just find this out empirically through trial and error. The best information producers are the ones that win the bets most of the time. And so essentially what prediction markets do is they take these betting dynamics and they scale them. And so if you've heard of prediction markets, maybe you've heard of them in the context of the last presidential election, where prediction markets were shown to do a lot better than polls or statistical models when it came to predicting that Trump was going to win the election. But that's just their latest triumph, and they've been around for a long time, and the reasons that they're successful have been discussed for a long time. And the main reason that they're successful is discussed at length in this book by James Surowiecki in 2004 called The Wisdom of the Crowds. And so essentially what they're doing is they're tapping into the wisdom of the crowds. And in order for crowds to be wise, Surowiecki discusses that individuals need to be independent, diverse, right? Viewpoint diversity, decentralized. And so that's in contrast to the madness of crowds. So of course crowds can be mad, and that occurs when you have social feedback loops within the crowd, right? That the crowd is too socially connected, and so they're not acting as individuals, and so it's not useful to aggregate their knowledge. And so what these markets do is they aggregate widely dispersed knowledge and distill it into a single probability or price. And they've been studied academically, actually, for decades. They have their own journal, their own academic journal called the Journal of Prediction Markets. They've been studied in the context of climate-related risks. This is a paper called Can Expert Prediction Markets Forecast Climate-Related Risks, where a conclusion is the predictions of the markets were consistent with good reliability. So a rather tepid endorsement, but an endorsement nonetheless. And so what I think that these would do, if we kind of embraced prediction markets, is it would reorient the way that researchers think about questions. So this is a current, common type of conclusion. Climate change has reduced corn yields by 10% relative to what they would have been without climate change, but retaining all other benefits of fossil fuels to agriculture over the past 30 years using method X and dataset Y. So I think this result is useful to the researcher professionally, but it's not very useful to the consumer of the information, to society or to decision makers. And so what a prediction market would do is be much more, it would focus the attention much more on the future, much more forward-looking, and it would reorient the research question to be, what will corn yields be in 2030? So I think that's much more useful. And so, academics, researchers could study the accuracy and reliability of prediction markets, or they could formulate models specifically to compete in prediction markets. And so I think that this would reorient the knowledge generation system around concrete falsifiable questions, which is a cornerstone of science, which I think is kind of lacking currently. Reduce incentives to signal good team membership, which is currently very useful to the researcher, but not useful to society. And increase incentives to produce the most useful information for society and decision makers. And so I think this would help break some of the social feedback loops that constrain climate science and get us closer towards a better public knowledge generation system that would garner more public trust.